My name's Anna. I'm an HE advisor here at the university. I'm joined by my colleagues Mark and Grace behind the scenes who are going to be helping out with the questions. So just in terms of how today will work, I'll shortly be handing over to Alana for her talk. Just to confirm that your video and audio won't be shared during this course of the session, but you can ask questions if you'd like to using the chat function on the right hand side of your screen. You can ask questions anonymously, so just tick the box if you want to do that, and you can also like other people's questions. If there's something that you particularly want to find out too, then we can make sure we prioritise the most popular questions. So my colleague Grace will be asking all those questions at the end, but feel free to pop them in the chat as Alana goes along. So I think that's everything, and I'll hand you over to Alana now.
Right. Hi, I'm Alana. Thanks for joining us. And as Anna just said, do ask questions throughout, and we'll answer them all at the end. So today is Holocaust Memorial Day, which commemorates the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. I wanted then to take the opportunity to think about how we learn about history. So the truth is, we're learning all the time, not just at school or in lectures like this or in textbooks. Everything we see or hear or read adds to the information we have about how the world works. Now, some of it's good and reliable information, some of it is less so. Not always because people are trying to trick us, although I think we all know that does happen, but also often because people telling stories are less concerned about providing 100% information and more concerned with getting us to feel a certain way, to make connections between our lives and what they're trying to tell us, even if those connections aren't, absolutely, completely, 100% unvarnished truth. So in my talk today, I'm going to examine the way that comic books in particular give us information about the Holocaust. And what I want to focus on is how the sort of information they present has actually changed over time as the way that people have understood and related to the Holocaust has changed. We're looking at comic books not to learn about the Holocaust as a historical event. Comic books are really not a great source for that kind of learning, but to learn about how people in the past have thought about the Holocaust, which is actually something comic books are really good at showing us. So, you read comics. You probably know about Magneto, yeah? If you've only been reading X-Men since about 2019, you probably only recognize Magneto as one of the leaders of the mutant nation Krakoa, one of the good guys. But if you've been reading longer, you know that Magneto has a bit of a past as a villain, going right back to the very first issue of X-Men in 1963. In the early X-Men books, Magneto was a pretty garden variety villain. He'd turn up, say some stuff about mutant superiority and the need to eliminate, humanity whose time has passed. The X-Men would show up, they would beat him up, foil his wicked plan, and Magneto would go away again for a few more issues until he reemerged with yet another villainous plan, lather, rinse, repeat. In fact, Magneto's whole thing about mutant superiority led the artists drawing the comics to often portray him in association with Nazi imagery, as we see here with this platoon of goose-stepping soldiers and banners reminiscent of the ones favored by the Third Reich that Magneto's collaborator, the Illusionist, is conjuring to make the people of the island of Santo Marco think they are being invaded and then surrender quickly. The whole mutant superiority thing that Magneto's always on about actually sounds a lot like eugenics, which is the pseudoscientific theory that underpins Nazi racial policies. Now, this portrayal reflects the basic level of public consciousness about the Holocaust in the early 1960s. Now, in spite of what you might think, because the 1960s were a lot closer to the actual Holocaust than today, there wasn't actually as much widespread knowledge and discussion about the Holocaust as there is today. There hadn't been a lot of discussion about it in the previous decade. When X-Men first appeared, this was really only just starting to change. There had been a few important books published, and of course there was the public trial of Adolf Eichmann in 1963, the same year that X-Men started printing. So readers who were too young to remember the war themselves, which is to say readers who were reading comic books at this point, might have recognized this imagery as having something to do with Nazi Germany and bad people. But they wouldn't have been coming to it as steeped in the sort of sustained discussion and analysis of the Holocaust that we're used to today. That didn't really take off properly until the 1980s. And that's when we also start to see a major shift in the way that Magneto is being portrayed. The new writers on the X-Men who take over at this point became more interested in developing character backstories, giving everyone on the page depth, not just letting them be stock characters that come on and say their usual thing and do their usual thing and then go away. Magneto's already existing association with Holocaust imagery, interestingly here, suggests the possibility that the Holocaust ought to be part of his backstory. And then the writers did something really interesting and maybe a little bit uncomfortable. They say, yeah, he absolutely has a Holocaust backstory, but it's not what you think. Magneto is actually a Holocaust survivor. He spent his childhood in Auschwitz. So there's a couple things to note here. Now, first, in the final panel here, Magneto's saying, as a boy I believed, and as a boy I turned my back on God forever. Now, this narrative of loss of faith among Holocaust survivors was widely popularized in Elie Wiesel's semi-autobiographical novel, Night, which quickly became and remains extremely popular, especially for use in schools. But while there hasn't been a systematic survey of the faith lives of Holocaust survivors, Wiesel's is just one story. There aren't a particularly large number of survivor stories that feature a major change in religious outlook like this one. So this is a case where even a reasonably good source for historical information, a survivor account like Elie Wiesel's, isn't necessarily a good source for general information, even though the writers of the comic seem to have taken it as representative of an experience common to many survivors. Now, the second thing is to notice is the person whose body he is holding here is Kitty Pryde. And Kitty Pryde, at this time, was the single token Jewish member of the X-Men. So there are layers of grief happening here. It's not just Magneto feeling bad that he killed or thinks he killed a child, but the fact that it is particularly a Jewish child is another callback to this Holocaust experience. Now, after this episode, this revelation signals the beginning of a reformation arc for Magneto. He even joins the X-Men for a while, and while he's a member of the X-Men, he accompanies Kitty Pryde, who of course wasn't really dead because it's a comic book. No one really permanently dies in comic books. He accompanies Kitty Pryde to Washington, D.C. for a Holocaust memorial event. Now, this comic was published in 1985, which is a few years after the United States President's Commission on the Holocaust, which was chaired by Elie Wiesel, recommended that a Holocaust Memorial Museum should be built. But it's 8 years before the actual museum was built. So the National Holocaust Memorial that's portrayed here never existed. What this comic's depiction of a National Holocaust Memorial is telling us is that the idea of a substantial memorial museum was something that people at the time were familiar with. This comic's also showing us the shift in perspective from one generation, the generation of Holocaust survivors, to the next, the generation of the children of survivors or the nieces and nephews of survivors. This is what the scholar Marianne Hirsch has called the generation of post-memory, the generation that needs museums and family stories to help them remember something they didn't actually experience. Now here again, we see Magneto in the last panel conveying an idea that was drawn from a Holocaust survivor memoir. This time it's Primo Levi's If This Is a Man, the idea that heroism is not, heroism in the Holocaust meant holding on to one's humanity while the Nazis tried their best to turn us into animals. The way to defy them, to defeat them, was to hold on to hope, no matter what. So again, we have a borrowing from a primary source of Holocaust memory and a popularizing of it. Now, Magneto didn't stay completely redeemed. He went back and forth between heroism and villainy over the next couple of decades. And while I'm not going to get into the details in this talk, a lot of his back and forth actually ended up mirroring public anxieties over the state of Israel's increasing military strength during these same decades. And that, again, very much mirroring public understanding and debate about the memory of the Holocaust. But even when Magneto was a villain, there were limits to what he was willing to do, as comes to the fore in his 1990 appearance in Captain America number 367, where Magneto had formed an alliance with the Red Skull. The Red Skull appears first in Captain America number 1, all the way back in 1941, as a Nazi, as one of Hitler's comic book Hitler's henchmen. Apparently, Magneto had only just met the Red Skull because he just found out that the Red Skull had been one of Hitler's henchmen, and immediately broke their alliance. Now, he stops short in this episode of actually killing the Red Skull. Instead, he ends up walling him up in a very deep basement room and making a long speech about how he hopes the Red Skull dies very slowly and suffers, while realizing that Magneto, because he didn't actually kill him, still has the moral high ground. Now, throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, there's an increasing concern about the possibility of a decrease in awareness of the Holocaust. That concern is, in fact, what leads eventually to the United Nations 2005 resolution creating International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which we are marking today. That resolution urged member states to develop educational programs that will inculcate future generations with the lessons of the Holocaust in order to help prevent future acts of genocide. Once again, we see a corresponding shift in the treatment of Magneto. From the 1980s onwards, when Magneto returns to villainy, his stated motivation is always the fear that mutants might meet the same fate as Jews had met in the Holocaust, and that therefore mutants should make a preemptive defense. Now, this fear is finally realized in New X-Men number 115 in 2001, when the island nation of Genosha, which Magneto had established as a refuge for mutants, was attacked by sentient robots programmed to hunt and kill mutants. This gave far greater weight to Magneto's arguments about the dangers of history repeating itself, and his arguments have carried that weight for the last 20 years of comics history. We also see a new presentation of Magneto's backstory with the 2009 publication of the 5-book miniseries Magneto Testament, which chronicles his childhood in Auschwitz. It has a very different graphic style from the main X-Men books, right? Much duller colors, much higher degree of realism. And we can see here it draws on some very recognizable images of Auschwitz, like the room with the pile of glasses confiscated from prisoners. And this drawing does appear to have been based on an archival photograph held by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, although the artist has also taken some liberties with the scale, blowing that pile up till it fills an entire room over the head of young Magneto. And that brings us back to just before we began. Right before Magneto appeared as the head of state of the new mutant nation of Krakoa, he appeared in the 2018 X-Men Holiday Special, in a set of panels set in the ruins of Genosha, where, in spite of everything, someone had found a menorah to use to mark Hanukkah, a winter festival that commemorates the survival of another Jewish community amidst a hostile ruling by a foreign power. While Magneto is initially cynical about the pointless gesture of lighting a menorah, asking what there is for mutants to celebrate or commemorate, he's quick to let the children here persuade him that the story of survival against the odds, is still worth celebrating. Now, the parallel being drawn here isn't just between fiction and history, between the struggle of mutants and the struggle of ancient Jews commemorated at Hanukkah. If that's what the writers of this comic wanted, then they could have used Kitty Pryde. But actually, Magneto's Holocaust survivor origin story also draws the memory of the Holocaust into this scene, placing Magneto at the center of 3 compelling stories of survival, tying fiction together with history, so that even if we no longer have first-hand or even second-hand knowledge of the Holocaust, we still have access to stories that can help us remember why it's so important to stop genocides before they begin. And that is, of course, the overarching educational theme of Holocaust Memorial Day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alana. That was brilliant. We are going to go to some questions, and we have had one question come in. So it says, why is it so important to have historical moments or events like the Holocaust in popular fiction such as comic books?
That is a really great question, and I think there are 2 reasons. First of all, from a creator point of view, having those little historical moments tie the story they're telling into the real world. They make it recognizable. They make it easier for readers to relate to and commit to. Second, there's always, especially with forms of popular media that are largely consumed by children and teenagers and young adults, there's always concern over whether our children are learning the right things, whether they're spending their time doing things that will help them develop properly, that will form them into future adults who will be good citizens. And one of the ways of addressing that concern is, again, to trickle through just enough educational material that you can say, but Mom, I'm learning something here. And that also then becomes why scholars like me get really interested in looking at how historical events are being portrayed. Because honestly, we know that probably someone who comes to our classroom for a year, 2 hours a week, 24 weeks out of a year, for us to tell them academic history, might not latch onto that with the same sort of emotional resonance as the sort of popular media depictions that they've seen week in and week out from childhood. Mm-hmm. So this tells us what the general baseline understanding is and where we can reach out to people to, align that general baseline understanding with the sorts of historical accuracies that we're most concerned with.
Yeah, brilliant, thank you. And the next question I can see, it's from Rebecca. You actually have touched on it a little bit, but she's asking, do you think comic books like these can be used to educate children on the Holocaust today? So do you think this is an effective way of educating?
Okay, let me be really clear about what I am and I'm not saying. I am not saying that school curricula should include these sorts of comic books as part of Holocaust education. I'm saying that school curricula should be written with the awareness that these kinds of representations are already part of what students ingest from the wider world, right? So should and shouldn't doesn't really come into it. Yeah. I'm saying they're there, they're doing this job. In some cases, they're doing this job with a great deal of care and sensitivity. In some cases, they really aren't, or maybe at the time they were written, they thought they were, but we would have a different view on that now. And we need to be aware of that and address that and in a self-critical way.
Yeah, absolutely. So the next question, why do you think Magneto's character was given the backstory of being a Holocaust survivor? What traits or ideas has this added to his character?
So I can tell you exactly why he was given that backstory, and that's because the writer who took over X-Men in the very late 70s, Chris Claremont, was Jewish and had spent time on a kibbutz in Israel, working with a lot of Holocaust survivors. And he recognized some interesting parallels between Magneto's preemptive violence. You have to look after your own people. You have to make them safe before there's a perceptible threat, because after someone decides to kill you all, it's too late. So that's kind of the rhetoric that he was hearing on a kibbutz in Israel in the early 1970s. So to him, this was a familiar language. He didn't stop to think, I think, at that time, that the obvious wider criticism becomes, wait a minute, you're saying that it's natural and inevitable for a survivor of genocide to become a perpetrator of genocide. We might want to maybe think about this a bit more. That became a really big controversy around the depiction of Magneto through the 80s and 90s, and that's kind of part of what the Magneto Testament series was aimed at undermining and correcting. But for someone in the 1970s and the early 1980s who was themselves Jewish and steeped in this culture, it seems to have just felt like a compelling, yeah, a little bit transgressive, but doesn't this just make a fascinating story?
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. Thank you very much. Do you think that the representation of the Holocaust in comic books fed into the lie which many people believe that the Holocaust didn't happen?
Yes, but because Holocaust denial is such a pervasive, nearly industrialized set of beliefs, anything and everything feeds into it, because people promoting that myth are absolutely determined to maintain it. But that is part of why I showed, for example, that comparison between the pile of glasses photo in the Holocaust Memorial Museum and the pile of glasses seen in Auschwitz in Magneto Testament, because that is a much, much bigger pile of glasses that's being depicted in the comic book. And it then does become really easy for someone wanting to argue that the Holocaust has been exaggerated, which is usually the gateway for claims that the Holocaust never really happened, to point to an image like that and say, look, there was never a pile that big. Sure, there were some glasses that were confiscated from prisoners, but actually, it was just a few. It was much smaller. And that's, I think, again, I think there has been a shift in awareness on the part of many people doing popular culture depictions of the Holocaust, and there is increasingly effort to really try to make those depictions accurate in a way that in the past there had been less concern for, to head off those kinds of criticisms.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Do you think it matters, or perhaps even damages the memory of the Holocaust in any way, if the portrayal in comic books, for example, isn't always completely historically accurate? Or do you think actually it's achieving the opposite?
Oh, I don't tend to think that memory is something that just exists all by itself. Memory is socially constructed. We remember things because they have meaning. We have disputes about how we remember things because we're really having disputes about the meaning that we want to attribute to that memory. So I'm not really wanting to draw lines about what damages the memory of the Holocaust, because there are a number of ways that we can remember the Holocaust that seem to me to be equally productive. Some comic book portrayals help some of those approaches and damage others, and vice versa. I do think maintaining a general sense that genocides happen and they're horrible and should be prevented, preemptively, if at all possible, which is to say, generally by the time we can look at whether an event meets the criteria laid out in the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide and say, yep, that is definitely a genocide that's happening. A lot of people have already died and had their lives irreversibly damaged, and that becomes then really too late to talk about meaningful intervention. It doesn't, therefore, to me, talking about patterns that may lead to genocides and making those recognizable, even if it's through things like comic books showing, what are the warning signs that things are about to go badly for mutants, that is actually a productive use of Holocaust memory.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And that brings us to our last question. So the last question is, do you think that depiction in comic books did help with Holocaust awareness in the 1990s and the early 2000s?
I'm not certain that it really helped necessarily with Holocaust awareness, because I think the 1990s was the beginning of the heyday of widespread Holocaust awareness efforts. I think what it actually helped with was Holocaust empathy. Mm-hmm. I say this having been in school in the 1990s when Holocaust education was actually really very preachy. It was a lot of, it was a lot of teachers who were also disconnected from the event, trying to tell us that we needed to always remember, for reasons that they themselves couldn't quite articulate, what the depictions of Holocaust survivors in popular media, in comic books, in television and film gave us at that point in time were characters who had longer stories. They weren't just popping up and saying, hello, I survived the Holocaust, and that's all you will ever know about me. They gave us a little bit more to relate to, and therefore some context for understanding that this was an event that really did shape people's lives. I think Holocaust education has gotten a bit more sophisticated in the last couple decades. I should also hasten to say that.
Definitely. Thank you so much for answering all of those questions. There were some tricky ones in there. So I'm going to hand back to Anna. Thank you, Alana.
Thank you.
Thanks, Grace, and thank you very much for such a brilliant Q&A session after a really thought-provoking talk. That was really interesting, really interesting. So thank you everyone for watching. Just to let you know, we have got more Kitchen Session live lectures being advertised on our website, and we've got various talks on all different subjects going on over the next few weeks. Do check us out if you want to look at any of those. But thank you very much to everyone for watching. Thank you.